The crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across mahogany surfaces, where ivory-handled letter openers still bore traces of red wax, and darker stains that housekeepers had learned not to question. Persian carpets muffled footsteps through corridors lined with Egyptian artifacts, their golden surfaces dulled by decades of fingerprints from hands that had never asked permission to take them. Behind oil portraits of distinguished ancestors, wallpaper peeled at the edges, revealing older layers beneath. Each renovation paid for by fortunes extracted from distant lands and local laborers who never lived to see old age. The leather-bound ledgers in the estate office documented every transaction with meticulous precision. Wages paid, debts collected, lives catalogued like livestock. For over 4 centuries, HIGHCLERE Castle had been Britain's most envied private estate, its grandeur celebrated in drawing rooms from London to Cairo. But the foundations beneath its marble floors were built on suffering that no amount of Downton Abbey nostalgia could cleanse. Was this England's most beautiful castle, or its most perfectly preserved crime scene? The current Earl of Carnarvon discovered that preserving his family's legacy meant confronting truths that 4 centuries of privilege had carefully buried. The morning light filtered through diamond-paned windows as George Herbert, 8th Earl of Carnarvon, pushed open the heavy oak door to his family's private study. The room exhaled the accumulated breath of centuries, leather bindings that had absorbed tobacco smoke from long-dead ancestors, Persian carpets that muffled secrets as effectively as footsteps, and the metallic tang of tarnished silver that no amount of polishing could entirely erase. Behind glass-fronted cabinets, Egyptian artifacts caught the pale Hampshire sunlight, their golden surfaces dulled by decades of fingerprints from hands that had claimed ownership over treasures they had never earned the right to possess. The ledgers waited on the mahogany desk like sleeping serpents, their leather spines cracked with age but their contents preserved in meticulous detail. Each volume represented decades of transactions, recorded in the precise copperplate handwriting of estate stewards who had understood that their employment depended upon maintaining certain silences. The Earl's fingers traced the gilt lettering on the spine of the earliest surviving volume, dated 1679, and felt the weight of accumulated guilt that no amount of contemporary celebrity could diminish. Inside these books lay the mathematical precision of exploitation. Column after column documented the systematic extraction of wealth from sources that polite society preferred not to examine too closely. Irish tenant farms appeared as mere numbers. Acres leased, rents collected, improvements withheld. The human cost remained carefully absent from these calculations. No accountant had recorded the children who died of preventable diseases in cottages that lacked adequate heating, or the families who emigrated to America not from ambition, but from desperation, born of rents that consumed 90% of their annual income. The Egyptian ventures received more romantic treatment in the family papers, yet their underlying mechanics proved equally brutal. Howard Carter's field reports, filed between social correspondence and hunting invitations, described archaeological sites with the clinical efficiency of mining operations. Burial chambers were cataloged not as sacred spaces, but as potential revenue sources. Local workers appeared in these documents only as labor costs, their names anglicized beyond recognition, their wages calculated to extract maximum productivity while maintaining subsistence-level existence. Staff members had whispered for generations about unexplained sounds emanating from the study during the early morning hours, when dawn light first touched the Egyptian collection. Housekeepers reported finding documents scattered across the floor despite locked doors and sealed windows. The current estate manager attributed these disturbances to the building's ancient foundation settling unevenly, particularly during seasonal temperature changes that caused wooden joints to expand and contract with audible creaks. Yet the sounds followed patterns that seemed almost deliberate, occurring most frequently during the anniversary weeks of significant deaths recorded in the estate's employment records. The numbers within these ledgers told their own story of systematic oppression that spanned centuries and continents. The estate encompassed 5,000 acres of Hampshire countryside, controlled by a single family for 342 years through a combination of strategic marriages, political manipulation, and legal mechanisms designed to prevent property redistribution. Employment records revealed over 150 full-time estate workers whose families had served the Herberts across multiple generations, yet whose wages remained 60% below national averages throughout the 20th century. Archaeological expeditions between 1907 and 1922 removed an estimated 3,500 artifacts from Egyptian burial sites, generating revenue streams that funded extensive castle renovations, while local communities struggled with infant mortality rates exceeding 23%. The contemporary value of these colonial extractions approached $47 million, wealth that enabled the family to weather economic downturns that devastated working-class households throughout Hampshire. The Earl understood that each page turned revealed another layer of complicity in systems of oppression that extended far beyond individual moral failings. The Herbert family had not simply participated in exploitation, they had refined it into an art form. Their innovations in labor control, tenant management, and cultural appropriation had influenced aristocratic practices throughout Britain and its empire. Other noble families studied Herbert methods for extracting maximum value from human resources while maintaining public reputations for benevolent stewardship. Political connections amplified every advantage. The families purchased parliamentary seats enabled them to influence legislation affecting property taxes, labor regulations, and colonial policies that protected their financial interests across 3 centuries. Campaign contributions and strategic social relationships transformed personal greed into public policy, ensuring that legal frameworks supported aristocratic privilege while legitimate grievances from workers and tenants encountered insurmountable bureaucratic obstacles. The servants' quarters, accessible through narrow staircases hidden behind false walls, revealed the physical architecture of social hierarchy that sustained aristocratic comfort. These rooms, barely larger than modern closets, had housed entire families whose labor began before dawn and continued past midnight. No central heating warmed these spaces during Hampshire's bitter winters, yet the castle's main rooms featured the latest technological innovations available in each era. Indoor plumbing served the family decades before estate workers gained access to clean water sources. Contemporary tourism had transformed HIGHCLERE Castle into a global destination, generating millions in annual revenue through carefully constructed fantasies that bore no resemblance to historical reality. Visitors celebrated fictional characters from Downton Abbey while walking through rooms where real servants had endured systematic abuse. Gift shops sold romantic narratives of aristocratic benevolence, while the estate continued employing workers at wages that required government assistance to achieve basic subsistence. The Earl closed the final ledger as shadows lengthened across the study floor. Outside, maintenance crews prepared the grounds for another day of tours that would celebrate the very systems of oppression these documents revealed in clinical detail. The choice before him was stark: continue profiting from sanitized fiction, or acknowledge the human cost that had built Britain's most celebrated private estate. Every room in Highclere Castle had been designed not just for comfort, but as a monument to the systematic subjugation of entire populations. The Great Hall rose 40 feet above visitors, like a stone cathedral dedicated to human inequality, its hammer-beam ceiling crafted from English oak that had required the deforestation of entire villages, whose residents received no compensation for their displaced livelihoods. Carved heraldic beasts glared down from wooden corbels, their painted eyes seeming to track movement across the marble floor below. The checkerboard pattern of black and white stone had been quarried by Italian craftsmen whose contracts specified payment rates deliberately set below subsistence levels, ensuring their families remained dependent on Herbert patronage for basic survival. Morning light streamed through stained glass windows that depicted scenes of noble triumph over defeated enemies, but closer examination revealed more disturbing imagery embedded within the decorative borders. Figures representing conquered peoples knelt in submission around the edges of each panel, their faces rendered with ethnographic precision that suggested direct observation rather than artistic imagination. The lead cane that held these glass pieces together contained traces of silver extracted from mines in colonial territories, where local populations had been conscripted into forced labor systems that generated raw materials for aristocratic renovation projects. The library embodied intellectual dominance as completely as the Great Hall demonstrated physical power. 20,000 volumes lined shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, their leather bindings representing centuries of accumulated knowledge that the Herbert family had systematically denied to the populations they controlled. Estate records revealed that tenant families were prohibited from educating their children beyond basic literacy, ensuring generational dependence on aristocratic employment. The most valuable manuscripts had been acquired through cultural appropriation, disguised as scholarly collection, including illuminated texts removed from Irish monasteries during periods of political upheaval that the Herberts had actively encouraged for personal profit. Hidden throughout the castle's public spaces, almost invisible unless specifically sought, lay the architectural infrastructure of surveillance and control. Priest holes originally designed for religious persecution had been converted into observation points that allowed family members and trusted servants to monitor conversations in the main reception rooms. These concealed spaces retained the musty odor of centuries of human occupation, their wooden walls marked with scratches and stains that suggested prolonged periods of uncomfortable hiding. Staff members reported hearing whispered conversations emanating from empty rooms, particularly during evening hours when tourist groups had departed and the castle settled into its nocturnal rhythms. The mechanical systems that supported daily life revealed the true hierarchy of human value within the estate's operations. Central heating pipes snaked through walls in complex patterns that prioritized family comfort while deliberately excluding servants' quarters and tenant accommodations. The boiler system, installed during extensive renovations in the 1890s, required constant manual feeding by workers who endured dangerous conditions in basement spaces that reached temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit during summer months. Medical records from the estate's private physician documented repeated cases of heat exhaustion and respiratory ailments among maintenance staff. Conditions that were treated as acceptable costs of maintaining aristocratic convenience. The numbers embedded within the castle's construction told their own story of systematic exploitation that spanned centuries and continents. The building's current structure represented 127 rooms spread across 50,000 square feet of interior space, requiring a permanent staff of 45 full-time employees whose combined annual wages totaled less than the family's monthly entertainment budget. Construction phases between 1679 and 1878 consumed building materials worth approximately $340,000 in contemporary values, equivalent to $47 million today, while quarry workers and craftsmen received payment rates that kept their families below poverty thresholds throughout their employment periods. The estate's art collection included over 800 individual pieces acquired through colonial ventures and cultural appropriation, representing estimated contemporary values exceeding $25 million, yet surrounding Hampshire villages lacked basic infrastructure improvements that would have cost less than $50,000 to implement. Import records documented the arrival of 156 tons of marble, precious stones, and exotic woods extracted from territories where local populations received no compensation for resource extraction. The drawing room functioned as a theater of social manipulation, where political alliances were forged and commercial partnerships established through carefully orchestrated displays of wealth and cultural refinement. Persian carpets covered floors with intricate patterns that told stories of conquest and submission, their production having required the labor of entire communities whose traditional weaving techniques were appropriated without acknowledgement or compensation. The room's acoustic properties had been deliberately engineered to carry whispered conversations to concealed listening posts, while masking sounds that might indicate eavesdropping to unsuspecting guests. Servants' staircases threaded through the castle like arteries carrying the lifeblood of invisible labor that sustained aristocratic comfort. These narrow passages, barely wide enough for two people to pass, connected the family's luxurious living spaces with cramped quarters where domestic staff endured conditions that would have been considered unacceptable for livestock. The stairs themselves showed wear patterns that revealed the intensity of daily use. Thousands of footsteps had worn smooth depressions in stone steps, creating hazardous conditions that contributed to frequent accidents among elderly servants, whose medical care remained entirely dependent on aristocratic generosity. Electrical systems installed during early 20th century modernization campaigns followed hierarchical principles that extended technological privilege selectively throughout the building. Family quarters received the latest innovations in lighting and communication, while servants' areas remained dependent on candles and gas lamps that created fire hazards and respiratory problems from poor ventilation. The wiring patterns created electromagnetic fields that some sensitive individuals claimed produced feelings of unease or disorientation, particularly in areas where the greatest disparities in technological access existed between family and staff accommodations. The castle's physical architecture served as a three-dimensional textbook in the mechanics of social control, where every design element reinforced hierarchies that transformed human beings into categories of economic utility. Visitors who admired the building's aesthetic achievements walked unknowingly through spaces that had been optimized for the systematic extraction of human dignity across 4 centuries of aristocratic dominance. The 5th Earl of Carnarvon's partnership with Howard Carter transformed archaeological discovery into organized cultural theft on an unprecedented scale. Lord Carnarvon stood in the shadows of the Valley of the Kings as Egyptian workers hauled limestone blocks from the entrance to what would become the most famous tomb in archaeological history. The desert air carried the acrid smell of disturbed earth, and something else, something ancient that seemed to cling to the artifacts emerging from chambers that had remained sealed for over 3 millennia. His hands, soft from a lifetime of aristocratic leisure, trembled slightly as he examined golden objects that represented not scientific discovery, but financial salvation for an estate hemorrhaging money through extravagant renovations and poor investments. The Egyptian expeditions had begun as romantic adventures, marketed to London society as scholarly pursuits that would advance human understanding of ancient civilizations. Private correspondence between Carnarvon and Carter, however, revealed motivations that had nothing to do with academic inquiry and everything to do with systematic looting, disguised as legitimate archaeology. Letters stored in HIGHCLERE's private archives documented detailed plans for artifact distribution that prioritized marketable objects over contextual significance, with Carter providing expertise in identifying pieces that would command the highest prices among European collectors. The tomb of Tutankhamun yielded treasures beyond Carnarvon's most optimistic projections. But the removal process required corrupting local officials and exploiting Egyptian workers whose traditional knowledge of burial sites had been passed down through generations of guardian families. These communities received no compensation for revealing locations they had protected for centuries, while British excavation teams claimed exclusive rights to discoveries that belonged to Egyptian cultural heritage. The golden mask that would become globally iconic was photographed in Carter's hands within hours of its discovery, establishing possession claims that superseded any consideration of cultural ownership. Workers on the excavation site reported strange phenomena that coincided with the opening of sealed burial chambers. Tools disappeared overnight despite locked storage areas, and several crew members experienced vivid nightmares featuring ancient Egyptian imagery they claimed to have no previous knowledge of. Local foremen attributed these incidents to desert heat and the psychological stress of disturbing sacred spaces, noting that similar reports had occurred during previous archaeological projects in the region. The timing of these disturbances, however, corresponded precisely with the removal of specific artifacts that Egyptian religious tradition considered particularly sacred. Behind the public narrative of archaeological triumph lay a network of cultural theft that enriched British collectors, while Egyptian communities remained mired in colonial poverty. Carnarvon's excavation permits, obtained through political connections rather than archaeological credentials, granted him legal authority to remove artifacts under terms that heavily favored British interests. The permit system itself represented institutionalized cultural appropriation, with British authorities determining the fate of Egyptian heritage, based entirely on European economic and political considerations. The mathematical precision of this organized looting revealed the industrial scale of cultural appropriation that funded HIGHCLERE Castle's continued grandeur. 12 separate excavation seasons between 1907 and 1922 yielded over 2,000 documented artifacts that were removed from their cultural context and never returned to Egypt. Private shipping records indicated that an additional 800 undocumented pieces left Egypt through unofficial channels, suggesting systematic smuggling operations that violated even the permissive colonial regulations of the period. Carnarvon's personal expenditures on Egyptian ventures totaled $340,000, equivalent to $23 million in contemporary currency, while local Egyptian workers received wages of 2 piastres per day, less than 1/3 the compensation paid to comparable British laborers. The financial returns from artifact sales and exhibition fees exceeded $500,000 during Carnarvon's lifetime, representing profits that enabled extensive castle renovations, while Egyptian archaeological sites suffered permanent damage from hasty extraction techniques. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb brought international celebrity that masked the exploitative nature of the entire enterprise. Newspaper coverage focused on the romance of archaeological adventure while ignoring the systematic dispossession of Egyptian cultural heritage. Carnarvon granted exclusive media rights to British publications, ensuring that Egyptian perspectives on the discoveries remained absent from global discourse. The narrative of British archaeological expertise obscured the reality that local Egyptian knowledge had guided most significant discoveries, with traditional guardian families providing information that had been preserved through oral traditions spanning millennia. Artifacts shipped to HIGHCLERE Castle carried with them not just monetary value, but the accumulated spiritual significance of cultures that had been systematically destroyed through colonial exploitation. The Egyptian collection, displayed in rooms designed to impress visitors with Carnarvon's sophistication, represented the physical embodiment of cultural theft on an unprecedented scale. Hieroglyphic inscriptions on stolen artifacts included curses and protective formulas intended to prevent exactly the kind of desecration that Carnarvon had orchestrated for personal profit. Carter's field notes, preserved in the castle's archives, documented a clinical approach to artifact removal that prioritized speed over archaeological integrity. Burial chambers were emptied with industrial efficiency, their contents cataloged according to monetary value rather than cultural significance. The removal process destroyed contextual relationships between objects that had been carefully arranged according to ancient Egyptian religious practices, reducing sacred assemblages to individual commodities suitable for private collection. The human cost of these operations extended beyond cultural appropriation to include the systematic exploitation of Egyptian workers whose traditional knowledge made the discoveries possible. Excavation records listed local employees by numbers rather than names, treating human beings as interchangeable resources whose expertise could be purchased at subsistence wages. Families who had guarded archaeological sites for generations found themselves excluded from benefit-sharing arrangements that directed all profits to British interests. Local Egyptian communities developed oral traditions about the Carnarvon excavations that characterized the enterprise as organized grave robbing rather than legitimate archaeology. These accounts, preserved in village histories, described systematic intimidation of families who questioned the removal of artifacts from sites their ancestors had protected. The legacy of exploitation continued long after Carnarvon's death, with subsequent generations of Egyptian archaeological workers remaining excluded from decision-making processes that affected their cultural heritage. The treasures displayed at HIGHCLERE Castle served as permanent monuments to cultural theft that had been legitimized through colonial legal frameworks designed to facilitate European appropriation of non-Western heritage. Generations of estate workers lived and died in poverty to maintain the illusion that aristocratic wealth was somehow natural and inevitable. The morning bell that summoned estate workers to their duties rang at 4:30 each day, its bronze voice carrying across the Hampshire countryside like a funeral dirge for dreams that would never be realized. In cramped cottages that lined the estate's outer boundaries, families stirred in darkness that penetrated every aspect of their existence. Children as young as 8 years old pulled on clothes that had been handed down through multiple generations, their small fingers already calloused from work that would consume their entire lives without offering any possibility of escape or advancement. Mary Whitfield had been born in one of these cottages in 1847, the daughter of a groundskeeper whose grandfather had also served the Herbert family, without ever earning enough to break the cycle of dependency that bound entire bloodlines to aristocratic service. Her daily routine began before dawn, with milking duties in barns that reeked of ammonia and rotting straw, their wooden beams blackened by decades of poor ventilation that caused respiratory ailments among workers who had no access to medical care beyond what the estate's veterinarian might provide during his rounds. The milk she collected each morning filled silver pitchers that graced the castle's breakfast table, yet her own children often went without adequate nutrition due to wages that remained deliberately calculated to prevent any accumulation of savings. Estate records preserved in the castle's archives documented a feudal system that persisted well into the 20th century, with workers tied to the land through debt arrangements that functioned as legalized slavery. Housing provided by the estate came with rental fees that consumed 60% of workers' wages, while additional charges for firewood, repairs, and access to common areas ensured that families could never accumulate enough resources to seek employment elsewhere. The cottages themselves lacked basic amenities that the castle had enjoyed for decades. No indoor plumbing, no electricity, and heating systems that consisted of single fireplaces inadequate for Hampshire's bitter winters. The physical labor required to maintain Highclere's aesthetic perfection destroyed human bodies with mechanical regularity. Gardeners spent 12-hour days bent over flower beds that covered 17 acres of ornamental grounds. Their spines curved permanently from repetitive motions that created chronic pain conditions for which no treatment was provided. The topiary gardens that impressed visitors required constant maintenance by workers whose hands bled from thorns and whose eyes suffered damage from working in direct sunlight without protective equipment. Estate physicians noted recurring cases of joint deterioration and premature arthritis among groundskeeping staff, conditions that were dismissed as inevitable consequences of manual labor rather than preventable occupational injuries. Children born on the estate attended schools that were deliberately designed to limit their educational opportunities while providing just enough literacy to perform menial tasks efficiently. The curriculum focused on obedience, religious submission, and practical skills that would make them valuable servants while ensuring they never developed critical thinking abilities that might lead them to question their circumstances. Teachers, employed directly by the Herbert family, received specific instructions to identify and discourage any student who showed exceptional intelligence or ambition that might threaten the established social order. Night shifts in the castle required servants to move through corridors where their footsteps echoed with an almost supernatural resonance, creating acoustic effects that some interpreted as ghostly manifestations. Kitchen staff reported hearing voices calling their names from empty rooms, particularly during the early morning hours when exhaustion made them susceptible to auditory hallucinations. These phenomena occurred most frequently among workers who had endured extended periods of sleep deprivation due to work schedules that provided fewer than 5 hours of rest between shifts. The castle's architectural acoustics, designed to carry sound through hidden passages for surveillance purposes, created audio distortions that could easily be mistaken for paranormal activity by stressed and overtired minds. The mathematical precision of this exploitation revealed the systematic nature of aristocratic wealth extraction from human labor over multiple centuries. Estate employment records documented 247 worker families who had served the Herbert family across 5 generations without a single documented case of economic advancement beyond subsistence level. Average life expectancy for estate workers remained 23 years below national averages throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, with occupational injuries and preventable diseases claiming lives at rates that would have constituted public health emergencies in contemporary standards. Medical expenditures for worker health care totaled less than $200 annually, while the family's entertainment budget exceeded $15,000 during the same periods. Housing provided for worker families averaged 420 square feet for households that often included 6 or more individuals, while guest bedrooms in the castle provided over 800 square feet for temporary visitors. Educational funding for estate workers' children remained fixed at 50 bahs annually for the entire community, while individual Herbert family members received private tutoring worth over $3,000 per year. Domestic servants within the castle endured conditions that combined physical exhaustion with psychological abuse, designed to reinforce their inferior status. Housemaids began work at 4 in the morning, cleaning fireplaces and preparing rooms before family members awakened, their labor deliberately timed to remain invisible to aristocratic eyes. The servants' dining hall, located in the castle's basement, featured tables and chairs constructed from wood, rejected as inadequate for use in family areas, while meals consisted of leftovers and ingredients deemed unfit for aristocratic consumption. Women employed as seamstresses and laundresses worked in rooms with inadequate lighting that caused permanent eye damage, while exposure to harsh chemicals used in fabric care created respiratory conditions that shortened their working lives significantly. The laundry facilities, housed in basement areas prone to flooding during heavy rains, subjected workers to damp conditions that promoted tuberculosis and other respiratory ailments. Medical records indicated that female servants experienced rates of occupational illness 3 times higher than comparable workers in urban industrial settings. The estate's agricultural operations required tenant farmers to surrender the majority of their crop yields as rent payments while assuming full financial responsibility for equipment maintenance, seed purchases, and weather-related losses. This arrangement ensured that farming families remained dependent on Herbert family approval for their basic survival, while providing no economic security during poor harvest seasons. Tenant agreements included clauses that prevented farmers from selling products to outside markets, forcing them to accept below-market prices for crops that generated substantial profits when sold through Herbert family commercial networks. Generational trauma became embedded in worker families, whose children inherited not only economic disadvantage, but also psychological conditioning that taught them to accept exploitation as natural and inevitable. Parents warned their children against displaying ambition or intelligence that might be perceived as threatening by aristocratic employers, creating cycles of self-limitation that served Herbert family interests across multiple generations. The true cost of aristocratic comfort could be measured not just in economic terms, but in the accumulated suffering of thousands of individuals whose lives were sacrificed to maintain the illusion that wealth and privilege represented divine approval rather than systematic theft. The Herbert family wielded their wealth like a weapon, purchasing parliamentary seats and manipulating political outcomes to protect their interests across 3 centuries. The smoke-filled chambers of Westminster became secondary offices for the Herbert family, where political power was traded like commodities in markets that existed beyond public scrutiny. Henry Herbert, the 4th Earl of Carnarvon, moved through parliamentary corridors with the calculated precision of a predator who understood that democratic institutions could be transformed into instruments of aristocratic control through careful application of financial pressure and social manipulation. His leather portfolio contained more than legislative proposals. It held the blueprints for systematic corruption that would influence British politics for generations. The purchase of parliamentary seats represented only the most visible aspect of Herbert family political manipulation. Behind the formal transactions lay networks of bribery intimidation, and blackmail that extended throughout the British political system. Private correspondence preserved in HIGHCLERE's archives revealed detailed strategies for compromising elected officials through carefully orchestrated social events, where alcohol, gambling debts, and sexual indiscretions created leverage that could be exploited when crucial votes required predetermined outcomes. The family's London townhouse served as headquarters for these operations, its opulent reception rooms designed to encourage the kind of behavioral excesses that produced valuable compromising material. Electoral corruption reached industrial scales during periods when Herbert family interests faced potential legislative threats. Vote buying in controlled constituencies involved systematic distribution of cash payments, employment promises, and debt forgiveness arrangements that transformed democratic participation into economic transactions. The family maintained detailed records of these payments, documenting the precise cost of purchasing each vote while calculating the return on investment generated by favorable legislative outcomes. These records revealed that democratic processes had been reduced to mathematical equations, where human agency was eliminated through financial coercion. The Herbert family's political machine operated through what contemporaries euphemistically termed interest management, but which functioned as organized subversion of democratic governance. Local magistrates, county officials, and parliamentary representatives found themselves dependent on Herbert patronage for their positions, creating hierarchical networks of corruption that extended from Westminster to village-level government. This system ensured that legal challenges to Herbert family exploitation encountered insurmountable obstacles at every level of the judicial system, while legislation that threatened aristocratic privilege faced coordinated opposition from officials who owed their careers to Herbert influence. Parliamentary debates on labor legislation, colonial policy, and taxation regularly featured speakers who had received direct financial support from the Herbert family, though these connections remained hidden from public knowledge. Members of Parliament who opposed aristocratic interests discovered that their political careers faced sudden obstacles. Damaging rumors appeared in newspapers owned by Herbert allies. Government appointments were mysteriously withdrawn, and social ostracism made effective political networking impossible. The family's ability to destroy political opponents extended beyond formal corruption to encompass character assassination and economic warfare that eliminated threats before they could gain sufficient support to challenge aristocratic dominance. The mathematical precision of this political manipulation revealed the systematic nature of democratic subversion that protected Herbert family wealth across multiple centuries. Documentary evidence showed the family controlled 3 separate parliamentary constituencies for periods totaling 127 years between 1689 and 1922, ensuring reliable votes for legislation affecting their economic interests. Electoral expenditures exceeded $50,000 annually during contested election periods, equivalent to $3.2 million in contemporary currency, while average working-class voters received payment offers ranging from 10 shillings to £5 for their electoral support. Parliamentary voting records indicated Herbert family interests achieved favorable outcomes in 89% of legislative matters affecting property taxes, labor regulations, and colonial trade policies. Political campaign contributions to Allied candidates totaled over $200,000 during the 19th century, while efforts to suppress opposition voting through economic intimidation affected an estimated 12,000 eligible voters across controlled constituencies. Government positions held by Herbert family members or their direct appointees included 23 ministerial roles, 45 administrative posts, and 67 judicial appointments that influenced legal interpretations affecting aristocratic privilege. The family's influence extended beyond British domestic politics to encompass imperial policy that protected their colonial investments and cultural appropriation activities. Colonial administrators who facilitated Herbert family archaeological expeditions and commercial ventures received promotions and prestigious appointments that advanced their careers while serving aristocratic interests. Trade regulations governing artifact exports from Egypt and other colonial territories were modified through legislative channels that the Herbert family controlled, ensuring that cultural theft remained legally protected under British imperial law. London social seasons became extended political campaigns where Herbert family members deployed carefully choreographed entertainment events to influence policy outcomes through informal persuasion and strategic relationship building. The family's ballrooms hosted gatherings where cabinet ministers, colonial governors, and financial leaders developed personal relationships that translated into favorable treatment for Herbert business interests. These social manipulations operated below the threshold of formal corruption while achieving identical results through psychological influence and cultural pressure. The House of Lords provided an institutional platform for Herbert family political influence that extended across party lines and transcended temporary electoral changes. Hereditary peerage granted them permanent political representation that could not be removed through democratic processes, while their ability to influence the selection of new peers ensured that the upper chamber remained dominated by individuals sympathetic to aristocratic interests. Legislative proposals that threatened established privilege faced systematic opposition from peer networks that the Herbert family had cultivated through generations of strategic alliance building. Judicial corruption complemented parliamentary manipulation through the appointment of judges whose legal interpretations consistently favored aristocratic interests in disputes involving property rights, labor relations, and colonial governance. The Herbert family's legal team included barristers who later received judicial appointments, creating direct channels for influencing court decisions that affected their economic interests. Legal precedents established through these corrupted judicial processes created frameworks that protected aristocratic privilege while denying legal recourse to exploited workers, tenant farmers, and colonial populations. The family's political influence manifested in supernatural-seeming ways that some observers interpreted as evidence of otherworldly power, though rational explanations suggested more mundane mechanisms of control. Government officials reported feeling compelled to support Herbert family positions despite their personal reservations, experiencing psychological pressure that seemed to originate from sources beyond ordinary political influence. These phenomena occurred most frequently during high-stakes legislative debates, where Herbert interests faced significant opposition, suggesting that the family's reputation for political dominance created psychological effects that amplified their actual influence. The legacy of Herbert family political corruption extended far beyond their immediate interests to encompass the fundamental transformation of British democratic institutions into mechanisms for protecting aristocratic wealth and privilege. The global success of Downton Abbey transformed HIGHCLERE Castle into a symbol of nostalgic elegance, but this popularity required the complete erasure of historical truth. The first tour buses arrived at HIGHCLERE Castle on a gray October morning in 2010, their passengers clutching guidebooks filled with fictional genealogies and romantic narratives that bore no resemblance to the castle's actual history. Lady Fiona Carnarvon stood at the entrance hall's threshold, watching visitors photograph rooms where they expected to find traces of beloved television characters, while remaining completely oblivious to the real suffering that had occurred within these walls. The transformation of her family's estate into a global tourist destination had required the systematic suppression of historical records and the creation of sanitized narratives that celebrated precisely the systems of oppression that had built aristocratic wealth. Television production had invaded every corner of the castle like a benevolent occupying force, bringing cameras and lighting equipment that illuminated spaces traditionally shrouded in aristocratic privacy. The production team's presence marked the beginning of a comprehensive historical revision that would redefine public understanding of British-class relations through carefully crafted fiction. Scripts portrayed aristocratic families as benevolent stewards who cared deeply for their servants' welfare, creating emotional connections between viewers and characters who exemplified everything that real aristocrats had systematically destroyed through centuries of exploitation. The fictional Crawley family embodied aristocratic virtues that had never existed among their real-world counterparts. Television episodes depicted servants who were treated with dignity and respect, whose personal problems received sympathetic attention from caring employers, and whose loyalty was rewarded with genuine affection rather than calculated manipulation. These storylines required the complete elimination of historical accuracy in favor of nostalgic fantasy that transformed systematic oppression into heartwarming paternalism. Tourism infrastructure developed around the castle created economic incentives for maintaining these fictional narratives while suppressing inconvenient historical truths. Gift shops sold merchandise celebrating characters who had never existed while ignoring the real people whose suffering had made aristocratic comfort possible. Guidebooks provided detailed information about fictional family trees and imaginary historical events while omitting references to actual exploitation, cultural theft, and political corruption that defined the Herbert family legacy. Tour guides received training that emphasized entertainment value over historical accuracy, teaching them to present sanitized versions of castle history that avoided any mention of worker exploitation or colonial appropriation. The guide scripts, developed in consultation with marketing professionals rather than historians, transformed rooms where real servants had endured systematic abuse into charming backdrops for romantic storylines about fictional characters who represented everything that actual aristocrats had never been. Visitors moved through the castle's rooms with reverent fascination, photographing spaces they associated with beloved television characters while remaining completely unaware of the real human costs that had created the luxury they admired. The Egyptian collection received particular attention from tourists who appreciated its aesthetic beauty without understanding that every artifact represented cultural theft that had impoverished local communities while enriching British collectors. Tour groups paused respectfully before portraits of Herbert family ancestors, listening to romanticized biographical sketches that omitted their roles in parliamentary corruption and systematic exploitation. The economic impact of television-driven tourism reached levels that dwarfed any previous revenue streams generated by the estate's traditional activities. Annual visitor numbers exceeded 120,000 during peak seasons, generating ticket revenues that surpassed $4.2 million per year, while additional income from gift shop sales, private events, and licensing agreements brought total tourism-related earnings to over $6.8 million annually. Hotel bookings in surrounding areas increased by 340% during the show's broadcast years, creating regional economic benefits that provided powerful incentives for local officials to support continued mythologizing of aristocratic history. Employment generated by tourism operations included 67 full-time positions and over 200 seasonal jobs, though entry-level wages remained at $18,500 annually, barely above minimum wage levels. The castle's marketing budget allocated $890,000 per year to maintaining its fictional brand identity, while spending less than $12,000 annually on historical education or acknowledgement of past exploitation. Merchandise sales featuring fictional family crests and imaginary historical narratives exceeded $2.3 million in revenue during the show's peak popularity. The psychological transformation of historical memory reached unprecedented scales as global audiences developed emotional attachments to fictional versions of British class relations that sanitized centuries of systematic oppression. International visitors arrived with preconceptions shaped entirely by television narratives, expecting to find evidence of the benevolent aristocracy they had learned to love through carefully constructed fiction. These expectations created pressure for continued historical revision, as disappointing tourists by introducing uncomfortable truths about aristocratic exploitation would threaten the economic benefits generated by maintaining romantic illusions. Social media amplified the reach of these sanitized narratives as visitors shared photographs and experiences that reinforced fictional versions of castle history for global audiences. Instagram posts and travel blogs celebrated the castle's beauty while perpetuating myths about aristocratic benevolence that reached millions of people who would never visit, but whose understanding of British history became shaped by entertainment rather than scholarly research. The viral spread of these romanticized images created cultural momentum that made historical correction increasingly difficult as fictional narratives became embedded in popular consciousness. Electronic equipment used for touring experienced unusual malfunctions in specific castle areas, particularly rooms housing Egyptian artifacts and former servants' quarters. Audio guides cut out during explanations of working-class life, while digital cameras occasionally produced unexplained interference patterns when photographing artifacts removed from burial sites. Technical staff attributed these problems to electromagnetic interference caused by outdated wiring systems installed during the castle's 1920s modernization, noting that similar issues occurred in other historic buildings with comparable electrical infrastructure. The transformation of Highclere Castle into a tourist destination created a parallel reality where fictional characters received more detailed biographical treatment than the real people whose lives had been consumed by aristocratic exploitation. Visitors could recite intricate details about imaginary storylines while remaining ignorant of actual historical events that had occurred in the same rooms they photographed with such reverence. Educational opportunities that might have provided historical context for aristocratic wealth were systematically eliminated in favor of entertainment experiences that reinforced romantic misconceptions about British class relations. The castle's library, which contained extensive documentation of worker exploitation and colonial appropriation, remained closed to public access, while tour routes emphasized spaces that supported fictional narratives about aristocratic virtue and working-class contentment. Contemporary Britain faced an uncomfortable choice: continue celebrating aristocratic fantasy or confront the systematic exploitation that built its most celebrated private estate. The morning mist that rose from Highclere's manicured lawns in November 2023 carried with it the weight of unresolved historical debts that 4 centuries of aristocratic privilege had accumulated but never acknowledged. George Herbert, the 8th Earl of Carnarvon, stood at his office window watching tour groups photograph the castle's facade, while remaining completely unaware that their entrance fees sustained a system of inequality that had persisted largely unchanged since the 17th century. The choice before contemporary Britain was stark and unavoidable. Continue profiting from sanitized historical fiction, or confront the systematic theft and exploitation that had created the nation's most celebrated symbols of cultural heritage. The ledgers that documented estate operations in the 21st century revealed patterns of exploitation that echoed their historical predecessors with disturbing precision. Modern employment contracts for estate workers contained clauses that restricted their ability to discuss working conditions publicly, while wages remained calculated to maintain dependence on aristocratic employment rather than provide genuine economic mobility. The language had evolved from feudal terminology to corporate euphemisms, but the fundamental relationship between aristocratic wealth and worker poverty remained mathematically identical to arrangements that had prevailed during the Victorian era. Archaeological evidence continued arriving at Highclere Castle through donations and acquisitions that maintained the family's tradition of cultural appropriation under the guise of scholarly preservation. Recent additions to the Egyptian collection included artifacts whose provenance documentation revealed ongoing patterns of cultural theft disguised as legitimate archaeological commerce. International antiquities markets provided mechanisms for transferring ownership of cultural treasures from their countries of origin to private British collections, perpetuating colonial relationships that extracted wealth and heritage from formerly colonized populations, while enriching aristocratic families who had orchestrated these systems for generations. Social media platforms amplified the global reach of romanticized aristocratic narratives, while simultaneously creating unprecedented opportunities for historical correction and accountability. Instagram posts celebrating Highclere's beauty attracted millions of viewers who remained unaware of the exploitation that had created the luxury they admired. Yet the same platforms enabled historians, activists, and descendant communities to challenge sanitized narratives with documented evidence of systematic oppression. The collision between fictional romance and historical reality created cultural tensions that forced public reconsideration of Britain's relationship with its aristocratic heritage. Educational institutions across Britain continued teaching curricula that emphasized aristocratic achievements while minimizing or eliminating discussion of the systematic exploitation that had made those achievements possible. History textbooks featured chapters celebrating British archaeological discoveries, while omitting analysis of the cultural appropriation and colonial violence that had enabled artifact extraction. Students learned to admire aristocratic architectural achievements without understanding the human cost of their construction or the ongoing inequality that their preservation required. The numbers embedded within contemporary estate operations revealed the persistence of historical inequality patterns that tourism revenue had actually intensified rather than ameliorated. The current estate maintained a valuation exceeding $137 million, while median household wealth in surrounding Hampshire communities remained below $24,000. Creating wealth disparities comparable to those documented during the Victorian period. Tourism operations generated annual revenues exceeding $4.2 million, while entry-level estate positions offered starting salaries of $18,500, wages that required government assistance programs to achieve basic subsistence levels. The castle's 300 individual rooms contrasted starkly with Hampshire's documented population of 2,847 homeless individuals who lacked access to adequate shelter. Tax advantages provided to historic properties through government heritage programs saved the Herbert family approximately $890,000 annually in public subsidies, while local schools struggled with budget shortfalls exceeding $2.3 million. Property maintenance costs that qualified for tax deductions totaled over $650,000 per year, while estate worker health care benefits remained capped at $1,200 annually per employee. Electronic surveillance systems installed throughout the castle for security purposes experienced recurring malfunctions that some staff members interpreted as supernatural resistance to modern intrusion into historical spaces. Security cameras positioned in rooms containing Egyptian artifacts frequently produced distorted imagery during nighttime hours, while motion detectors triggered false alarms in patterns that seemed to correspond with phases of the moon. Technical analysis revealed that the castle's limestone construction created electromagnetic interference patterns that affected sensitive electronic equipment, particularly during periods of high atmospheric moisture that increased the conductivity of mineral deposits within the building structure. Legal challenges to aristocratic land ownership faced systematic obstacles that echoed the judicial corruption that had protected Herbert family interests for centuries. Property laws that had been crafted during periods of aristocratic political dominance continued providing legal frameworks that made wealth redistribution nearly impossible, despite growing public support for addressing historical injustices. The same parliamentary processes that had once been corrupted through direct bribery now operated through more subtle mechanisms of influence that achieved identical results while maintaining the appearance of democratic legitimacy. International pressure for artifact repatriation created unprecedented challenges to the cultural appropriation that had enriched British aristocratic collections for generations. Egyptian government officials demanded the return of artifacts that had been removed during colonial-era excavations, while legal precedents established in other repatriation cases suggested that traditional claims of legitimate ownership might no longer provide adequate protection for collections built through systematic cultural theft. The Herbert family's Egyptian collection faced potential legal challenges that could result in the loss of artifacts whose financial value exceeded $25 million, while their cultural significance to Egyptian heritage remained incalculable. Contemporary activism leveraged digital technologies to document ongoing patterns of exploitation while connecting current injustices to their historical precedents. Social media campaigns highlighting estate worker conditions attracted international attention that threatened the carefully constructed brand identity upon which tourism revenue depended. The contrast between fictional narratives celebrating aristocratic benevolence and documented evidence of continued exploitation created public relations challenges that traditional damage control strategies proved inadequate to address. Climate change impacts on historic properties created additional financial pressures that threatened the sustainability of aristocratic estate management, while highlighting the global inequalities that had always characterized aristocratic wealth accumulation. Insurance costs for protecting castle collections from environmental damage exceeded $200,000 annually, while climate refugees displaced by environmental destruction received no compensation from the fossil fuel investments that had historically enriched aristocratic portfolios. The final accounting revealed that contemporary Britain could no longer maintain the comfortable fiction that aristocratic heritage represented cultural achievement rather than systematic theft. The choice was no longer whether to confront historical exploitation, but whether that confrontation would occur through voluntary acknowledgement or involuntary social transformation that would sweep away aristocratic privilege regardless of elite preferences. The shadows that fell across HIGHCLERE's grounds as evening approached carried within them the accumulated weight of centuries of unredressed grievances that could no longer be hidden behind romantic narratives or tourism revenue, demanding resolution that would define Britain's relationship with justice for generations yet to come.